The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie as Rebecca Miller sat beside her husband's fresh grave, holding her twin babies close to her chest. The wooden cross she had carved with shaking hands bore his name and a simple date. A life, cut short by fever in the middle of nowhere. Just 3 days had passed since William took his last breath, and already the world felt impossibly different. The sound of voices carried across the camp as the other families packed their belongings into covered wagons. Rebecca could hear children laughing and mothers calling out instructions, but none of those voices belonged to people who cared about her anymore. She had become invisible overnight, a burden nobody wanted to acknowledge. "We can't wait any longer," Captain Morrison had told her that morning, his weathered face avoiding her eyes. "Winter's coming fast, and we've got women and children to think about." Rebecca had stared at him in disbelief. "I have children too," she had whispered, looking down at the tiny faces of her newborn twins. "They're barely 2 weeks old." The wagon train leader shifted uncomfortably, kicking at the dirt with his worn boot. "That's different, and you know it. You can't keep up with babies. You'll slow us down, and we can't afford that. Not with the weather turning." Around the camp, other families continued their preparations as if nothing was happening. The same people who had shared meals with Rebecca and William just days before now pretended not to see her desperate situation. Mrs. Patterson, who had helped deliver the twins, quickly looked away when Rebecca caught her eye. The Johnson family, who had been their closest friends on the trail, suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. Rebecca's heart pounded as she realized they were serious about leaving her behind. "Please," she had begged, following Captain Morrison as he walked toward his wagon. "I can manage, I won't be any trouble." But the man's mind was already made up. "You've got no husband to drive your wagon. You can't handle a team of oxen while caring for 2 babies. And we can't spare a man to help you. It's just not practical." The word practical hit her like a physical blow. 3 days ago, she had been part of a community heading west to build new lives. Now she was just a problem to be solved by abandonment. As the sun climbed higher, the wagons began forming their familiar line. Rebecca watched from beside William's grave as families she had known for months prepared to continue their journey without her. The children she had played games with during long evening stops now kept their distance, sensing the adult tension they couldn't understand. Young Billy Thompson, who had often helped Rebecca gather firewood, approached hesitantly with his mother, close behind. "Why aren't you coming with us?" he asked in his innocent way. His mother quickly pulled him back. "Don't bother the lady, Billy. She has things to figure out." Rebecca's throat tightened as she watched the boy being led away. Even the children were being taught to avoid her now. The twins stirred in her arms and she looked down at their peaceful faces. They had no idea their world had just crumbled. In their small minds, as long as they were warm and fed, everything was fine. If only life could stay that simple. "You've got the broken wagon and the 2 horses," Captain Morrison said, approaching her one final time. "There's a settlement maybe 50 miles east. If you turn back now, you might make it before the snow gets too deep." 50 miles. Alone. With 2 newborn babies and a wagon that had been giving William trouble for weeks. The wheel was cracked, the canvas had several tears, and one of the horses had been limping for days. But these people were offering her this, as if it was generous. Rebecca wanted to scream at them, to shame them for their cruelty, but she knew it would change nothing. Instead, she simply nodded and watched as Captain Morrison walked away, probably relieved that she wasn't going to make a scene. One by one, the wagons rolled past her. Some drivers tipped their hats politely, as if they were passing a stranger on a normal day. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet her eyes. A few women looked back with what might have been sympathy, but not one of them spoke up to challenge the decision. The dust from the wagon train hung in the air long after the last wagon disappeared over a distant hill. The sound of creaking wheels and lowing cattle faded, until Rebecca could hear nothing but the wind moving through the prairie grass and the soft breathing of her babies. She stood there for what felt like hours, still unable to fully believe what had happened. The camp that had been bustling with life just that morning now looked like a ghost town. Scattered pieces of broken equipment and cold fire pits were the only signs that dozens of people had lived here. Walking back to her wagon, Rebecca took inventory of what she had left. A bag of flour that might last 2 weeks if she was careful. Some dried beans and a small piece of salt pork. A few tins of preserved fruit that William had bought as a treat. It wasn't nearly enough to last until she could reach help. The wagon itself was in worse shape than she had wanted to admit. The cracked wheel would need constant attention, and she wasn't sure how long the patched canvas would hold against wind and rain. The 2 horses looked tired and underfed. One was definitely favoring his left front leg. But this was what she had. This broken-down wagon, 2 struggling horses, and whatever strength she could find within herself. The alternative was to sit by William's grave and wait to die, and that wasn't an option with 2 babies depending on her. As evening approached, Rebecca built a small fire and prepared what might be her last hot meal for days. The twins slept peacefully in their makeshift cradle, unaware that their mother was planning an impossible journey. Looking at their tiny faces by firelight, Rebecca made a promise. "I'll get you somewhere safe," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I will." The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and somewhere out there lay a settlement that might offer hope. 50 miles had never seemed so far, but it was the only chance they had. Tomorrow, she would harness the horses and begin a journey that many would consider hopeless. But tonight she would allow herself to grieve, not just for William but for the community she had lost and the security that had been stripped away so suddenly. Tomorrow would require all her strength, but tonight she could acknowledge how frightened she really was. The fire crackled softly as Rebecca held her sleeping children and stared into the darkness, trying to find courage for the impossible days ahead. The first morning alone felt like waking up in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Rebecca opened her eyes to find frost covering the wagon's torn canvas, and her breath came out in small white clouds. The twins were crying, their tiny voices cutting through the silence of the empty prairie. She pulled them close, trying to warm them with her own body heat, while her mind raced with all the things she needed to do. Loading the wagon took twice as long as she expected. Every item had to be chosen carefully, what was necessary for survival versus what was too heavy to carry. William's tools stayed behind, too heavy and useless without his strong hands to wield them. His favorite books, the ones he had read, to her by firelight during their courtship, were left in a neat pile beside his grave. The twins' extra blankets, the good china her mother had given her, even the small mirror she had treasured. Everything that wasn't absolutely essential had to be abandoned. The lame horse struggled to pull the wagon, even after she removed half, their belongings. Every few hundred yards, Rebecca had to stop and check the cracked wheel, tightening the rope that held it together. The other horse seemed healthy enough, but she could see ribs showing through his coat. The animals needed grain, but she had none to spare. By midday, they had traveled perhaps 5 miles. At this pace, it would take weeks to reach the settlement, and she didn't have weeks' worth of food. The babies needed to eat every few hours, and each feeding drained more of her strength. Her body was still recovering from childbirth, and the constant worry was making it harder for her milk to come. On the 3rd day, the first snow began to fall. Light flakes at first, dancing on the wind like tiny butterflies. But Rebecca knew what this meant. Winter was coming early, and she was still 40 miles from anywhere that might offer help. The temperature dropped as the day wore on, and by evening the ground was covered in a thin white blanket. That night she made a decision that broke her heart. She shot the lame horse. The animal had been struggling more each day, and she couldn't afford to feed something that couldn't pull its weight. The meat would keep her alive longer, and 1 horse was easier to manage than 2. As she watched the life fade from the animal's eyes, Rebecca felt a piece of her own humanity slip away. The next morning brought a new challenge. The remaining horse refused to move. Whether from grief for his companion or simple exhaustion, the animal stood in the traces and would not budge no matter how she pleaded or pushed. Rebecca spent hours trying to coax him forward, but he seemed as defeated as she felt. Finally, she made another impossible choice. She would have to leave the wagon behind and continue on foot, carrying only what she could manage with the babies. The thought of walking across the prairie with 2 infants seemed insane, but staying put meant certain death when the weather turned worse. She packed the last of the food into a canvas bag, wrapped the twins in every blanket she could carry, and set off across the endless grassland. The horse followed behind, unburdened now and apparently willing to walk as long as he didn't have to pull the heavy wagon. Walking was harder than she had imagined. The ground was uneven, full of hidden holes and loose rocks that turned her ankles. The babies grew heavier with each mile, and she had to stop frequently to rest and feed them. The horse grazed on the sparse grass, but Rebecca could see he was getting thinner by the day. On the 8th day, her food ran out completely. She had been rationing carefully, eating barely enough to keep herself alive, but the small portions were finally gone. Her milk was drying up from stress and hunger, and the twins cried constantly now. Their small bodies racked with hunger she couldn't satisfy. Desperation drove her to try hunting. William had taught her to shoot, but she had never killed anything larger than a rabbit. The rifle was heavy and awkward in her weak hands, and the noise scared the horse terribly. After hours of patient stalking, she managed to bring down a small prairie dog. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was food. She forced herself to eat it raw, knowing she couldn't risk a fire that might attract unwanted attention. The snow continued to fall intermittently, sometimes light dustings, sometimes heavier storms that forced her to take shelter wherever she could find it. She learned to dig shallow caves in hillsides, using her body heat and the horse's warmth to keep the babies from freezing. Her hands were constantly cold now, and she could barely feel her fingers when she tried to hold the rifle. By the 2nd week, Rebecca knew she was dying. She had lost so much weight that her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her vision was blurry from hunger, and sometimes she found herself talking to William as if he were walking beside her. The babies were quieter now, too weak to cry as much, and this frightened her more than their constant wailing had. The horse was in even worse shape. His ribs showed clearly through his dull coat, and he stumbled frequently. Sometimes he would stop and stand with his head hanging low, as if he too had given up hope. Rebecca would stroke his neck and whisper encouragement, but she knew the animal was reaching the end of his strength. On the 14th day, another storm hit. This one was fiercer than any they had faced, with wind that cut through her thin coat like a knife. The temperature dropped so fast that the horse's breath froze in the air, and Rebecca could barely see through the swirling snow. They took shelter against a rocky outcrop, but the wind found every gap in their makeshift windbreak. Rebecca, huddled with the twins pressed against her chest, sharing what little warmth her body could provide. The horse stood nearby, his back to the wind, ice forming in his mane. She could feel the babies growing cold despite her efforts, their tiny bodies shivering against hers. As the storm raged around them, Rebecca realized this might be their last night alive. She was too weak to travel further even if the weather cleared. The babies needed more than she could give them, and the horse was ready to collapse. They were still miles from any settlement, lost in a wilderness that showed no mercy to the weak or unlucky. She pulled the twins closer and whispered the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, trying to give them what comfort she could as the wind howled like a living thing around their small shelter. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the storm, she thought she heard something moving, but exhaustion was making her imagine things that weren't there. The cold was winning, and Rebecca knew it. But she held her babies close and refused to give up, even as the storm tried to claim them all. The wind hit like an angry beast, howling across the prairie with a fury that made Rebecca's blood run cold. What had started as gentle snowflakes an hour earlier had turned into something far more dangerous. The air was so thick with swirling snow that she could barely see her own hands, and the temperature was dropping so fast that her breath froze before it left her lips. Rebecca pressed herself deeper into the rocky shelter she had found, pulling the twins as close to her body as possible. The babies had stopped crying hours ago, which scared her more than all their previous wailing combined. When babies stopped crying, it usually meant they were too weak to make noise. She could feel their tiny bodies shivering against her chest, and their breathing seemed shallow and rapid. The horse stood just outside their makeshift cave, his back turned to the storm. Ice was forming on his mane and around his nostrils, but the poor animal seemed too exhausted to seek better shelter. His legs shook with each gust of wind, and Rebecca wondered if he would still be standing when morning came. If morning came, for any of them. She had never experienced cold like this before. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was deadly. The wind cut through her thin coat as if she wore nothing at all, and her fingers had gone numb hours ago. When she tried to adjust the blankets around the babies, her hands moved clumsily, like wooden blocks attached to her arms. The storm seemed to have a voice of its own, screaming and moaning as it tore across the empty land. Sometimes the wind would die down for a moment, giving Rebecca hope that the worst was over. But then it would return with even greater force, driving snow horizontally into their shelter until she had to turn her back to protect the babies from the stinging ice, crystals. As the hours passed, Rebecca felt her strength leaving her body like water draining from a broken bucket. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 3 days, and her body was using up the last of its reserves trying to keep warm. Her milk had almost completely dried up, and the twins were growing weaker by the hour. Their small faces were pale, and their lips had a bluish tint that terrified her. She tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep in this cold could mean never waking up. But exhaustion was a powerful enemy, and several times she caught herself nodding off, only to jerk awake when the wind shifted and drove snow into her face. Each time she woke, it was harder to focus, harder to remember where she was and why she was fighting so hard to survive. The horse made a low, mournful sound that cut through the wind. When Rebecca looked up, she saw the animal swaying on his feet, his eyes dull and unfocused. He was dying, she realized. They all were. This storm was going to finish what hunger and exhaustion had started. Around midnight, the temperature dropped even further. Rebecca could feel the cold creeping into her bones, making her joints ache and her muscles cramp. She tried to move her feet and discovered she couldn't feel them at all. When she looked down, she saw that ice had formed on the edges of her boots where her breath had frozen and fallen. The twins were so still now that she had to put her ear close to their faces to make sure they were still breathing. Their tiny chests rose and fell in quick, shallow movements, but their skin felt cold to the touch. She rubbed their backs gently, trying to stimulate circulation, but her own hands were too numb to be effective. Fear gave way to a strange kind of peace as Rebecca realized they probably wouldn't survive until dawn. She had fought as hard as she could, made every sacrifice possible, but sometimes that wasn't enough. The prairie was claiming them, just as it had claimed countless others who had dared to cross its vast emptiness unprepared. She thought about William, buried now under the snow many miles behind them. At least they would be together again soon. The idea brought her a comfort she hadn't expected. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of survival on her shoulders. Soon that burden would be lifted. The storm seemed to sense her surrender and pressed its attack. The wind grew even stronger, rocking her back and forth in the shallow cave. Snow began to pile up at the entrance, threatening to seal them inside, their rocky tomb. Rebecca tried to push it away, but her movements were slow and clumsy. The cold was winning, and she was too tired to fight anymore. She pulled the twins closer and began to hum a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. Her voice was barely audible over the wind, but it gave her something to focus on besides the cold. The words came back to her slowly, each verse a memory of warmth and safety from a time when the world made sense. One of the twins stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, and Rebecca felt tears freeze on her cheeks. Even in their weakened state, her babies knew she was there. She owed it to them to keep fighting, to hold on as long as possible. Maybe the storm would pass, maybe someone would find them. Maybe miracles still happened on the frontier. But as the hours crawled by, hope became harder to maintain. The horse collapsed sometime before dawn, his legs finally giving out under the strain. He lay in the snow just outside their shelter, his breathing labored and irregular. Rebecca wanted to help him, but she could barely move herself. The baby's breathing became even more shallow, and their skin took on a waxy appearance that Rebecca recognized from her grandmother's final days. They were slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. All her fighting, all her sacrifice, and she was going to lose them anyway. She closed her eyes and tried to accept what was coming. They would freeze here together, and eventually someone might find their bodies and wonder who they were and how they had ended up so far from anywhere. Or maybe the wolves would find them first, and there would be nothing left to discover. The wind began to die down slightly as dawn approached, but it was too late. Rebecca could no longer feel the twins moving against her chest, and her own breathing was becoming difficult. The cold had settled deep into her core, and she knew she was minutes away from losing consciousness forever. Then, through the fading storm, she heard something that didn't belong to the wind. Footsteps, crunching through the snow with the steady rhythm of someone walking with purpose. At first she thought her dying mind was playing tricks on her, but the sound grew closer and more distinct. Someone was out there in the storm, moving toward their shelter. Rebecca's eyes snapped open at the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to listen through the dying wind. Maybe her frozen mind was playing tricks on her. Maybe death was making her hear things that weren't really there. But the sound came again, closer this time, and definitely real. Fear shot through her exhausted body like lightning. Out here in the middle of nowhere, during a deadly blizzard, what kind of person would be walking around? Her thoughts immediately went to the stories she had heard around campfires, tales of desperate men who had turned to terrible things to survive the harsh frontier. What if whoever was out there meant harm to her and the babies? She tried to move deeper into the rocky shelter, but her frozen muscles wouldn't respond properly. The twins lay still against her chest, their breathing so faint she had to concentrate to feel it. They were barely alive, and she was too weak to protect them if danger was approaching. The footsteps stopped just outside their shelter. Rebecca held her breath, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows. Through the swirling snow she could see the dark outline of a tall figure. The person stood motionless for several moments, as if studying the scene before them. Then a voice spoke, low and calm, saying words she didn't understand. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone didn't sound threatening. It sounded almost concerned. The figure moved closer, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of dark skin and long black hair braided with leather strips. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what she was seeing. A Native American warrior stood at the entrance to their shelter, studying the dying horse and the scattered remains of their desperate journey. Everything Rebecca had ever been told about such encounters flooded her mind. The wagon train leaders had warned constantly about hostile tribes who showed no mercy to white settlers. Captain Morrison had shared stories of families found scalped and burned, their wagons looted and destroyed. But as Rebecca watched in terrified silence, the man did something completely unexpected. He knelt beside the collapsed horse and placed a gentle hand on the animal's neck, speaking softly in his own language. There was kindness in his voice, not the cruelty she had been taught to expect. The warrior noticed movement in the rocky shelter and turned his attention toward Rebecca. When their eyes met, she saw intelligence and compassion, not the savage hatred she had been told to fear. He said something else in his language, and when she didn't respond, he tried a few words in broken English. "Woman. Hurt?" he asked, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Rebecca couldn't find her voice. Everything she had been taught told her to scream, to fight, to protect her babies at all costs. But she was too weak to fight, and something in this man's manner made her hesitate. He moved slowly, carefully, as if he understood how frightened she must be. The warrior studied the scene more closely, the frozen woman clutching 2 tiny bundles, the dying horse, the signs of a desperate struggle for survival. His experienced eyes took in details that told the whole story without words. This was not a threat to be eliminated, but a tragedy to be prevented if possible. He moved to his travel pack and pulled out materials Rebecca didn't recognize. Working quickly but methodically, he began building a proper windbreak using techniques she had never seen before. He arranged stones and branches in a pattern that seemed to channel the wind away from their shelter, creating a pocket of relatively calm air. Next, he started a fire using methods that seemed impossible in the wet snow. Within minutes, flames were dancing in a small circle of stones, throwing blessed warmth toward Rebecca and the twins. She had been trying to start a fire for hours without success, but this man had accomplished it in less time than it took her to gather kindling. The warmth hit her frozen face like a physical blow, and she gasped involuntarily. The warrior looked up at the sound and saw tears streaming down her cheeks. He said something gentle in his own language, then switched back to his limited English. "Fire good. Warm babies," he said, gesturing toward the bundles in her arms. For the first time in hours, Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. This man wasn't here to harm them. He was trying to save them. But why would he help white settlers when his people and hers were supposed to be enemies? The warrior approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. He pointed to the twins and made gestures that clearly asked permission to examine them. Rebecca's instincts screamed against letting a stranger touch her babies, but she could see they were dying. If this man could help them, she had to let him try. With trembling hands, she loosened her grip on the twins. The warrior knelt beside her and gently examined each baby, checking their breathing and feeling their small bodies for signs of life. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, calloused hands. He spoke quietly as he worked, and though Rebecca couldn't understand the words, the tone was soothing. The man reached into his pack again and pulled out what looked like dried herbs and a small leather pouch. He heated water in a metal cup over the fire and mixed something that smelled sharp and medicinal. Using his finger, he carefully placed tiny drops of the mixture on each baby's lips. "Medicine," he explained in English, seeing her worried expression. "Make strong." Rebecca watched in amazement as color began to return to the twins' faces. Their breathing became deeper and more regular, and one of them actually made a small sound. The first she had heard from either of them in hours. Whatever the warrior had given them was working. He turned his attention to Rebecca next, offering her the warm cup. The liquid tasted bitter but immediately spread warmth through her frozen body. She felt strength returning to her limbs and clarity to her thoughts. This man was saving their lives with knowledge she couldn't begin to understand. As the hours passed, the warrior continued his care. He fed the fire, adjusted their shelter to maximize warmth, and periodically gave more of his medicine to both Rebecca and the babies. He worked tirelessly, never seeming to tire or lose patience with his unexpected patients. The storm finally began to weaken as dawn approached. The warrior stepped outside and studied the sky, reading signs in the weather that Rebecca couldn't see. When he returned, he seemed satisfied that the worst had passed. "Storm go," he announced. "You live." Rebecca looked at this man who had appeared from nowhere and saved her family from certain death. Everything she had been taught about his people was wrong, at least when it came to him. He had shown more kindness to strangers than her own wagon train had shown to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely working after hours of silence. "You saved us." The warrior nodded solemnly, understanding her gratitude even if he couldn't follow all her words. But Rebecca could see in his eyes that he was already thinking about what came next. They were alive, but they were still in the middle of nowhere with winter closing in. The real challenge was just beginning. The morning sun broke through the clearing clouds like a promise of hope. Rebecca woke to find herself warm for the first time in weeks, wrapped in a soft buffalo hide that the warrior had placed over her during the night. The twins were nestled against her chest, their cheeks pink with healthy color and their breathing strong and steady. She could hardly believe they were all still alive. The warrior sat by the fire, carefully preparing what looked like a morning meal. He had somehow found food in this barren landscape: roots, dried meat, and something that smelled like herbal tea. When he noticed she was awake, he smiled slightly and offered her a wooden bowl filled with warm broth. "Eat," he said in his careful English. "Need strong for walk." Rebecca accepted the bowl gratefully, surprised by how hungry she felt now that she wasn't dying. The broth tasted better than any fancy meal she had ever eaten, warming her from the inside out. As she ate, she watched the warrior tend to her horse, which had somehow survived the night and was now standing on shaky legs. Communication was difficult at first. The warrior knew perhaps 20 words of English, and Rebecca knew nothing of his language. But they managed to understand each other through gestures, simple words, and the kind of patience that comes from shared hardship. His name sounded like Grey Wolf when he said it, though Rebecca wasn't sure if she was pronouncing it correctly. Over the next 3 days, Grey Wolf continued to care for them with a dedication that amazed Rebecca. He hunted small game with silent skill, always managing to find food even when she saw nothing but empty prairie. He gathered plants she had never noticed, brewing medicines that kept the twins healthy and helped her strength return day by day. But more than just keeping them alive, he was teaching her things she had never imagined. How to read the sky for weather changes, which plants were safe to eat and which could heal sickness, how to move quietly across the land without leaving obvious tracks, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death out here. Most surprising of all was how gentle he was with the babies. This man who had been described to her as a savage warrior would spend hours entertaining the twins with soft songs in his own language. He carved small wooden toys for them, and seemed genuinely delighted when they smiled at his efforts. Rebecca had never seen a man so comfortable with tiny children. As her strength returned, Rebecca began to face a difficult truth. She was falling in love with this man who had saved her life. Not the desperate gratitude of someone rescued from death, but something deeper. She admired his wisdom, his kindness, his quiet strength. When he looked at her, she saw respect and caring, not the pity she had expected. But she also knew how impossible such feelings were. She was a white woman with 2 babies, and he was a native warrior whose people were at war with settlers like her. Even if they shared feelings, what kind of future could they possibly have together? Grey Wolf seemed to understand her internal struggle without her saying anything. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching the twins sleep, he began to speak in a mixture of English and gestures that told her his own story. His wife had died in childbirth 2 winters ago, along with their baby. He had been alone since then, traveling far from his people to deal with his grief. "You understand sadness," he said, touching his chest where his heart was. "Lose husband, lose baby. Same sadness here." Rebecca felt tears in her eyes as she realized they had both been running from similar pain. They had found each other. In the wilderness, 2 broken people who somehow made each other whole again. As the days passed, Rebecca had to make the hardest decision of her life. Grey Wolf had offered to take her to the nearest settlement, where she could try to rebuild her life with other white people. Or she could come with him to his people, where she would be safe but forever an outsider, in a world she didn't understand. "What do you want?" she asked him one evening, though she wasn't sure he would understand the question. Grey Wolf was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and slow. "Want you safe. Want babies grow strong. Want..." He struggled with the English words, then simply touched her hand gently. Rebecca understood. He wanted the same thing she did, a chance to build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. But he was leaving the choice entirely up to her. That night, Rebecca lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. A month ago, she had been a naive settler woman who believed everything she had been told about the world. Now she knew that kindness could come from the most unexpected places, and that the line between civilization and savagery wasn't where she had been taught to look for it. The wagon train that had abandoned her had been made up of people who called themselves Christian and civilized, but when she needed help, they had thrown her away like garbage. This man, who they would have called a heathen and a savage, had risked his own life to save strangers and asked for nothing in return. In the morning, Rebecca made her choice. She would go with Grey Wolf to the settlement because she knew the babies needed to grow up among people who looked like them. But she would not forget what she had learned in the wilderness, and she would not let others forget either. The journey to the settlement took 4 more days. Grey Wolf traveled with them the entire way, making sure they were safe and well fed. When they finally saw the wooden buildings and smoke from chimneys in the distance, Rebecca felt her heart breaking. This was where they would have to say goodbye. At the edge of town, Grey Wolf stopped and prepared to leave. He had sewn them warm clothes from animal hides and packed enough dried food to last for weeks. He had done everything possible to ensure their survival. "Will I ever see you again?" Rebecca asked, surprised by how much the thought of losing him hurt. Grey Wolf smiled sadly and touched her face gently. "Maybe. World is big, but sometimes people find each other." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Rebecca watched until he disappeared over a hill, then picked up her babies and walked into town to begin a new life. The people of the settlement welcomed her with the kind of charity that made her feel both grateful and guilty. They gave her food, shelter, and work that would allow her to support her children. They asked few questions about how she had survived alone on the prairie with 2 infants. But Rebecca never forgot the man who had saved them. Years later, when tensions between settlers and native tribes reached their worst point, she would speak out as one of the few voices calling for understanding instead of hatred. She would tell her story to anyone who would listen, reminding them that humanity could be found in the most unexpected places. And sometimes on clear nights when the wind blew from the west, she would take her children outside and tell them stories about the brave warrior who had taught them all that the world was bigger and more complicated than most people ever imagined.